Welcome everyone to today's webinar. For those of you who would like to listen to the English interpretation, we have put the instructions in the chat box on the GoToWebinar control panel. This session will be in Spanish with interpretation in English.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar that we're going to talk about scientific evidence, its meaning, and its contribution to drug demand reduction. My name is Gabriel. I'm the subdirector of ISSUP. ISSUP is the International Society of Professionals in Prevention and Treatment. We are an organization, an NGO, with more than 20,000 members in more than 170 countries. Our objective as an organization is to develop a workforce in drug demand reduction. In order to achieve that, we train, update, and specialize professionals who work in drug demand reduction. I want to take advantage of this opportunity to invite you to join our network of professionals who work in prevention and treatment. You can become members on our website, which is www.issup.net. And as a member, you will receive information about the activities, virtual events, and hopefully soon in-person events on our website and our YouTube channel. You can also access all of the information regarding this webinar and all the videos that have been recorded of our webinars. After the webinar, we will also send you an email with the video of this webinar, and you'll also receive a certificate of attendance. At the end of today's presentation, there'll be time for questions and answers, and so we'd like to invite you to send your questions through the chat that's on the right of your screen, and at the end, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. I'm going to repeat some instructions in English now.
Today, I would just like to remind you that if you would like to listen to this in English, we have put the instructions for you to join the English interpretation through the Interactio platform in our chat. So you just have to access the chat of GoToWebinar and follow the instructions there. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida a...
So I'd like to welcome today's guest. It's my honor to present Dr. Jose Luis Vázquez Martinez. Dr. Vázquez Martinez is a Mexican physician, graduated from UNAM School of Medicine, specializing in treatment of addiction, and with a master's in prevention of drug consumption. He obtained it from the University of Veracruz. Dr. Vázquez Martinez worked as part of the mental health department of the government of the federal district. He was also head of the promotion department for prevention of addiction for social services of workers in his state. And he was also deputy director in the National Commission Against Addiction, CONATIC, since 2012. He's collaborated as a specialist in the drug demand reduction department in CICAD. Dr. Vázquez Martinez has participated in different specialized publications. He's part of the academic team specializing in the treatment of addiction that's taught in juvenile centers, and he's also an instructor that specializes in virtual courses. So please, Dr. Martinez. Thank you very much, Livia, my dear friend. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from today. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today in the opening of the event in this forum that's so important that we're commenting. But from what we see, that there's lots of interest, there's lots of people connected with us today. And we thank everyone who are joining our activity today, because it's very important with a very interesting issue, a very important topic. And we need to be very clear on this. And it's also very important for our current reality. Because of the contingency of the situation, we have certain participants that are top notch. Some people are joining us and that will teach us and contribute a lot in the sense of information. Where they'll share the information that they know and the knowledge that they have. And there'll also be time for a Q&A at the end of their presentation with Dr. Gabriel Rada about uh, scientific evidence, which is key for us. As as our dear colleague Livia Edgar has already told us from ISSUP, I am currently working as part of the team of the Drug Demand Reduction Unit of the Inter-American Commission, CICAD, and OAS. And we have amongst our different duties and activities and mandates that are given to us by the member states, we always have to look for the highest level of development of we look for opportunities to make sure that people and countries can have at their disposal public policies and strategies, activities, actions that allows them to properly approach the problem associated to the consumption of psychoactive substances and the consequences produced and the problem that is derived from drug consumption and all the consequences that might happen because of consumption directly. So for us, it's very important to guide ourselves through political documents, political mandates that we have in that sense. And here, it's very important to mention and refer to the Hemisphere strategy on drugs. It was recently approved by the member nations of OAS, and it reflects the spirit of the countries of our hemisphere who agree with international world policies involving or derived from political mandates from around the world. We agree with conventions and other documents that have been created related to drug policies. The hemisphere strategy on drugs in the case of OAS and CICAD is accepted by all our member states, and it mentions very important issues regarding today's topic regarding scientific evidence. And the hemisphere strategy, as I mentioned, is a consolidation of what the countries have, what the countries agreed to, the vision that they have regarding drug policy and how to implement these policies and actions led by scientific evidence. As you know, scientific evidence, and we will hear from this today, especially through Dr. Rada, but it's fundamental to understand what this evidence consists of, what are its characteristics. There are many types of evidence, and throughout the different political negotiations that we've held, we've seen that the countries identify different levels or different degrees of validity, of importance to the evidence that's contributed from different sectors and with different characteristics. So it is fundamental and key to highlight the term scientific evidence, because it's the evidence that's obtained exactly through a controlled methodology done with scientific rigor that allows us to be certain about what are the characteristics of information and what we're observing in that sense, derived from a methodology that is rigorous, carried out correctly, well directed, well designed specifically. And I insist, it provides us certainty regarding its characteristics and the way the results are obtained and the conclusions that can be obtained, or elements for discussion that can be obtained. And they're supported by scientific methodology. And that methodology is not just what one person thinks or their opinion. No, it's objective. It's an objective result after a well carried out scientific analysis. And it's also reviewed by different opinions that includes different scientific disciplines and contribute several components regarding conclusions or the results that will be obtained. Now, going back to the strategy that I mentioned, beyond what we consider as scientific evidence, this rigorous evidence, always led by the scientific method, but our hemisphere strategy on drugs for 2020 of our member states provide some clues that they say that the response to this phenomenon, the consequences of the consumption of substances in the Americas and the world, requires a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach and always based in evidence, always respecting human rights and fundamental liberties according to the principle of common responsibility that takes into account the causes of this problem. And the member states, they need to assess the application of this strategy and everything that's derived from it, a corresponding action plan. In this case, they will use for this assessment impact indicators that are evidence based. Therefore, this will allow us to strengthen the policies and national actions. And the mechanism to do this is the multilateral assessment mechanism, where we have indicators of impact that are evidence based, and the countries show all of this information, or they contribute all this information through the different instruments that have been defined. For example, the multilateral assessment mechanism. The strategy defines that the states need to develop and implement strategies on drugs that are evidence based, and whenever possible, the data that they report or they use to assess these strategies need to be compiled in a common format that allows them to be compared and analyzed, hopefully amongst the countries. But necessarily, we need to do this comparison the states also establish and strengthen observation laboratories or other technical offices where, and one of their main functions is to generate or encourage scientific research, compile and organize and analyze and disseminate information that can be a good baseline for the development and implementation of policies and strategies on drugs. They're evidence based that reflect dynamic realities. Also, amongst the measures related to demand reduction, there are also a series of elements associated to evidence, where we mention and reiterate that drug consumption is a social problem that's complex. It has many causes. It's heterogeneous and requires an interdisciplinary public health approach between sectors, always based in evidence. I'd like to highlight demand reduction because it's the unit in CICAD that I belong to, and obviously it's led by Jimena Kalapsky, the head of our unit for demand reduction. And we have the drug demand reduction unit, but we also have other units within CICAD that use the same approach. It's derived from what's been established in political documents in our hemispheric strategy and our action plan, and they take scientific evidence into account because it directly determines these instruments. We'd like to invite you to review the political documents that are at our disposal, where we talk about scientific evidence. The documents are on the CICAD website. You can search them directly with just look for CICAD, and you can find our page very easily within the OAS website. And there you can find the information regarding this issue. And obviously, one of our objectives is also to collaborate together with the other agencies and international organizations. And today, this is a reflection of our collaboration with other institutions, where today, apart from having the honor and pleasure of being called by ISSUP globally and different national chapters with whom we also have a close relationship, and with ISSUP in general, we also have allied organizations, including Colombo Plan, with their office, regional office, or worldwide headquarters, and for the Spanish-speaking countries and Caribbean countries, the Colombo Plan has also joined us, and it's my honor to introduce you to Dr. my colleague and friend Marino Montenegro, who's the director of this office for Latin America and the Caribbean, and plays a fundamental role in the organization of our today's event. Because in the past, I've had the chance to hear and learn from Dr. Gabriel Rada about scientific evidence, specifically related to drug policies and processes on how they're generated. Well, Mariano, previously, he's also encouraged the participation of Dr. Rada on this issue. I remember very clearly a series of webinars that we had with Paraguay regarding the cannabis and its relation to evidence. So I think that Mariano is one of the people that needs no formal introduction, because everybody really knows him. He has a long track record, even though he's very young. He never ages, if you can see him on screen right now. He doesn't need any Instagram filters to shed the years. He's been working on this issue for a long time, and several of us have learned a lot from him. So it's my honor to now open the floor to Dr. Marino Montenegro for him to also speak with us. Once again, I'd like to thank you on behalf of SIGAD, and we'll also be here so that at the end of the presentations, we can coordinate a Q&A session. Mariano, please. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jose Luis. I'm very happy to be here with all of you, with the great colleagues and great friends. Thank you very much to ISSUP. ISSUP Global promoted this event, and it's very important. So thank you very much to Jose Luis and OAS and SICAD. We're friends. We walk the same path, especially in the Americas, Latin America and the Caribbean. Well, in all of the Americas. So it's truly a pleasure. Now, my job is to introduce Dr. Rada, introduce our issue, because clearly for Colombo Plan, it's absolutely key for us to start working hard on scientific evidence, because everything, all of our training is evidence-based, all of it. And obviously, we respect international conventions, we respect the fact that drug consumption is a public health issue. We also respect the fact that we have to respect human rights. All the political statements from the United Nations or OAS, we are completely behind them. But another crucial issue in political statements is that all policy must be evidence-based. Because our topic, as you know, we have almost 300 people online already. Our topic has lots of myths. There's lots of fanatism involved, and there's lots of business involved. Here we have, in some way or another, we have sectors and positions that are complicated for us. It's obvious that we should be evidence-based. We never doubted this. We never doubted it when it came to cancer, when it came to diabetes. We never doubted it when it came to rheumatism or cardiovascular diseases. But when it comes to addiction, to problem drug consumption, a bunch of beliefs, mythologies, fanatism, and business starts creeping in. So here, the industry gets involved. The industry, the illegal industry, because they want people, obviously, to consume drugs. That's their business. And that destroys public health. but we are protecting public health in our people with our conventions, our member state agreements, and social agreements of protecting public health. So being evidence based is at our core, but it's also an issue that I commented to Dr. Rada. I also commented to Livia and Jeff and our friends from ISSUP that it's been mishandled, at least in America. In America, the industry or the people who want other people to consume drugs, they're talking a lot about scientific evidence, but incorrectly. They're not being rigorous at all. And that's why it's so important for society, the International Society of Professionals, those of us who work in this, that this is our major assembly. And I think it's marvelous to have this forum for scientists, for professionals. And that way we can agree, seriously agree, on what we understand by scientific evidence, because we're always going to talk about evidence. From Colombo Plan, we're going to always train based on evidence, not based on beliefs or myths, or not fake news and not propaganda. So in America, as I was mentioning to ISUP Global, we're going through a critical moment, especially when it comes to some drugs, perhaps marijuana, psychedelics, methamphetamine, where there's a certain manipulation of information using evidence that's fake. As I said, it could be fake news, it could be a selection of certain studies that are done just to back up their own position, which is something that Gabriel can tell us about with cherry picking, or clear propaganda, just propaganda sometimes. So we have to be very clear on how to defend our evidence point because we're also defending public health. And that's something we can never forget. Not only are we training people in order to provide proper treatment and social integration, we're also taking care of public health in general because drugs cause damage and serious damage. And they damage people, but they also damage social collective health. Let's not forget that this isn't just individual health. Obviously, that's involved as well, but it's a collective social thing. We've seen it with COVID 19. Dr. Rada is also an expert in COVID 19, helping the Chilean government and not just in COVID, but many other diseases. But COVID 19 is a collective problem. And drug consumption is also a collective pandemic that ruins whole populations. Let's not forget that it ruins the ones that have the least. We have to be very clear on that. So we have to be very rigorous because many times the people who don't have a voice, they have no way to defend themselves from this. And they're subjects to propaganda, to misinformation, fanatism, and the drug industry. So I'm deeply pleasured to introduce Dr. Rada. Dr. Rada is a physician who specializes in internal medicine, professor from the Catholic University of Chile, a distinguished professional when it comes to teaching what we understand by scientific evidence-based medicine. Today, medicine cannot even be conceived if it's not evidence-based. Not just in my experience, because I'm a little bit older than Dr. Rada, but I managed to see that transition of professors who said, in my experience, we do it like this. And from then on out, but I managed to see the transition. It wasn't just my experience, it was what does evidence say? And not in order not to cherry pick, right? So obviously I value and respect experience, but in order to make major decisions in public policy, it's not enough to just rely on one person's experience. It's necessary to have evidence. And evidence, as Jose Luis said, will just, or Dr. Raya will teach us that it has a certain hierarchy. It has levels of hierarchy. When we talk about evidence, not only do we talk about one hierarchy or one single level, they're different levels. And obviously, we can differentiate them from lies, from fake news, and propaganda. So, Dr. Rada is teaching at Catholic University of the Institute. He's also a member of Cochrane, Chile. So, they are the major teams who look for evidence in many healthcare problems. The institution that he leads has been awarded many grants to prove evidence for different diseases in Chile. For example, they guarantee diseases, so we need to show the proper treatments with evidence so that the state finances that treatment and not other treatment in many different pathologies. And I met him because he was deeply interested, as he will explain, in the drug issue, because there was too many lies, and people and everybody was talking about evidence, but nobody could prove it easily. So for us, it's tremendously important to hear from him now, and obviously to show an example of evidence in our topic, which is highly critical. So we have to avoid this misuse. For example, saying that marijuana is useful for everything, for example. They use it for 100 diseases, and how true is this? That's key because propaganda is unleashed. So thank you very much. I'll join you again for the Q&A, but now let's leave Dr. Rada with you. So thank you very much, Gabriel. So the floor is yours. The stage is yours to share your experiences. Thank you. Thank you very much to Mariano and the organizers for this opportunity of, of sharing with you these issues that are so important. As Mariano said, I'm not an expert in drugs, so to speak, in the demand reduction. I'm more of an expert, or we created a certain expertise in the processing of scientific evidence with all of the standards of rigorousness and independence that are required, and then how to carry this on to a decision making arena. It's not just evidence. It's not just finding or synthesizing evidence. It's also about getting involved more and more in decisions. And as we'll see during the presentation, evidence is a necessary component, but it's not enough. And the Epistemonicos Foundation, of which I'm the co-founder and current chairman, has a process through which it starts involving itself in different issues, top priority issues for a country or a region or for the world. And in that sense, this is where I met Mariano actually. The role that cannabis can have as therapy could affect decisions that are then made when it comes to regulating this product. So I'm going to show the example a bit further, but today's presentation wants to show you or illustrate what is this scientific evidence thing, or evidence-based medicine, the original term. We're going to see that it's not necessarily the most correct term, but it's the one that many people know best, at least in Chile and in Latin America in general. It's practically the only term actually that's used to refer to this methodology. In other countries, it's changed a little bit. And then we're going to illustrate with some examples about medicinal cannabis and cannabis derivatives to apply these concepts that we're going to see in the first part of our presentation. Well, just very briefly, Epistemonicos is a foundation. It's a nonprofit that's based in Chile, but with collaborators and members from different countries. And it promotes the use of scientific evidence in decision making and public policies in healthcare in general. We're doing some we're getting involved in some areas beyond healthcare, but for now, most of our work is healthcare based. There's several products or databases and resources that we've created and that today are widely used all over the world. And and probably if you're enthused after this presentation and you want to apply this will be very useful for you. That's why I put them here. Epistemonikos is a Greek word that means something that's worth knowing. That's why we named it that. And our original name for our database. If you can't spell it very well, if you just Google it, there's no other similar word online, so it'll redirect you to the right place. The website of our foundation is epistemonicos.cl. CL is our Chilean page. That's where we have all the information of the foundation and all the projects, which are very varied. The database, which is one of the most well-known resources of our foundation, and which originated the foundation, is epistemonicos.org. And the repository and the platform for evidence classification, the overview of evidence, it's, it's a simple address. It's easier to remember. It's iloveevidence.com. Now, so evidence-based medicine. Whenever I start explaining this approach to decision making in healthcare or other areas, this sentence from this American journalist said, "For every complex problem, there is another that is clear, simple, and wrong." Because there aren't solutions that are simple for complex problems, and decision making in healthcare, and especially in this area, the area we're talking about today, is extremely complex. Therefore, we cannot expect some magic wand to come around, or some magic silver bullet that will find simple solutions to problems of this degree of complexity. Many years ago, more than 20 years, in the British Medical Journal magazine, a couple of authors published when this methodology was starting to get known. They published a satirical article where they would say, if medicine is not based on scientific evidence, then what could it be based on? So he said there are 7 alternative models, alternatives to evidence-based medicine, and each one of them reflected a way of doing medicine without being backed by science. They had an eminence-based medicine, as Mariano said, where the physician, because they're an expert, because they consider themselves an eminence, they think that they have the last word. The vehemence-based medicine, who yells louder, eloquence, trying to convince the other with your arguments that are not science-based, the providence-based, and so on. So obviously, this was satirical, but the article goes into how we could apply a decision-making way in medicine or in healthcare that's not evidence. Back then, certain types of evidence that we'll get into later were already very clear. The controlled assays or randomized tests, the meta-analysis, the systematic review, and different ways of measurement. And here, for this each alternative model, they had a marker or measurement instrument. It's a very fun article if you'd like to see it. Today, our methodology is much more accepted. And that's what this article was about. If we don't use scientific evidence as a fundamental component of the decisions that we make, then the decisions won't make sense. And medicine has never consisted of anything different. I think this is there's a series of mechanisms, tools, conceptual frameworks in order to carry out this process of decision making that are well informed by scientific evidence. Here, well, I know it's a little bit tough to translate. To translate this in English, it says instead of it'd be like clairvoyance-based medicine. So that we've continued to add more of these alternative models, unfortunately. But what is this all about? In order to understand this methodology, basically, it's very important to put the objective first. What is the objective of the methodology? And this is conceptualized like this more and more. This is a methodology to inform decision making, to tell us what to do, what is the best path of action when we have different alternatives. And I'm going to show you an example. Perhaps this isn't healthcare related, but that's a decision that we would have to make. If, let's say, if we wanted to choose between two houses, one is made from solid materials, as concrete, traditional materials, and another one made from traditional material, but with modern construction techniques such as adobe, a mix of dirt and straw and a series of other things to generate bricks that, and today it's still used in many countries. So we have the typical house, but then we have the modern adobe house. They both look very similar, and when we have to make a decision on which one to purchase, you have to balance certain things. In Chile, where we have a we're unfortunately we're constantly struck by earthquakes very frequently. That they're part of Chileans' day-to-day life. Most of the population, when asked about what house they would choose, they say the solid material house because it's common knowledge that they're more resistant when it comes to quakes. However, if we include other elements in this decision making process, it becomes more complex to predict what a group of people would prioritize. And in a personal case, doubts arise. What are the advantages and disadvantages? And we start, as I said, doubts start to appear in our. For example, if we add that the traditional house is not only more earthquake resistant, it needs less maintenance, less chance of insect pests. It's cooler in the summer, but the adobe house is more friendly to the environment. It's built by small businesses. It's cheaper and it's warmer in winter. So, with more information, with more variables, with more aspects to take into consideration, the decision becomes more complex. And if to that we add the magnitude of all of these possible benefits or advantages, the decision becomes even more complex. If we add, for example, the fact this is just fictitious data, but if we added that the increase of the resistance to earthquake is only 5%, repairs are only 3% less, the risk of pests is only 1% less, and it's 7% cooler in the summer. But on the other hand, it's 50% friendlier with the environment. 80% of them are built by small businesses. It's 70% cheaper and 60% warmer in winter. Probably the people who used to be in favor of the solid old construction will probably then choose the adobe construction for the reasons that we see there. So the magnitude, the amount of benefits also are also an important factor when it comes to decision making. It's not just what are we talking about, it's how much are we talking about. And when we talk about how much we're talking about, what the magnitude of the benefits, it's very important to have information expressed correctly, expressed in the way that allows us to make decisions or allows us to balance the different elements that have to be considered. This is a fictitious example of a shampoo, a hypothetical shampoo called Lightning Killer. It could be promoted as the safest shampoo in the world because with its advanced anti-static technology, it reduces the risk of being struck by lightning by 99%. If we see this briefly, we'll say, oh, it sounds marvelous. 99% less risk of something terrible like being struck by lightning. But clearly, everyone who's read this are going to notice immediately that there's something fishy going on. There's something that just doesn't make sense. And what doesn't make sense is that the risk of being struck by lightning is extremely low in most contexts. In Chile, the risk of being struck by lightning is 1 in 10 million. For a country like Chile that has a little bit less than 20 million people, that means that 11 million Chileans would have to use the shampoo in order for one of them not to be struck by lightning. So it's a benefit. It's very low in terms of how many people could actually benefit. And on the other hand, your hair, it doesn't look good after you use it. It causes itchiness and it's more expensive. So then we could say, in order to balance all of the aspects related to using the shampoo, we need to have information presented correctly. So, so the important message of this part of the presentation is that in order to make decisions, we need scientific evidence. And we also need to have information translated into something that's useful, something that we can actually use and incorporate in our decision making process. A sentence we always use to express the importance of evidence or the role that evidence has in decision making is that research evidence is necessary but not sufficient for decision making. Also, another way to separate or conceptualize this process is that there's two stages. One has to do with scientific evidence itself, the global research that's been done on a certain issue. In most cases, the global evidence is the one that we use to inform decisions. And the other component are the decisions or recommendations that will be taken in specific contexts. And these decisions or recommendations are local, they're contextualized. So we always say that evidence is global, but decisions are local. And here we're going to require contextual local information in order to finally make the right decision. We're going to see a brief video. I believe that the organization is going to transmit this. It's a very short video, 5-minute video that explains in a little bit more detail what medicine, evidence-based medicine is. I'm not sure if I have to stop sharing my screen. What you always wanted to know about evidence-based medicine. In this video, we will explain in a few minutes what is evidence-based medicine, how is it different from other ways of practicing medicine, and how is it practiced. Evidence-based medicine is an approach that tries to optimize decision making in healthcare through the use of the best possible or available scientific evidence. By evidence, we refer to the results of scientific research, typically clinical studies or compilations of different clinical trials that exist for a specific problem. By decisions, we refer to all situations in the context of healthcare where we have to decide between different alternatives of care. For example, if using to use a medication or not, or if medication A is better than medication B, or if a diagnosis exam is better than another, or if surgery is better than a non-surgery treatment. It's a way to organize, or if one way of organizing healthcare can be preferred over another. But why was evidence-based medicine born? Basically, a group of doctors realized that the practice of medicine was not always based on what research said or what scientific evidence said. And although some physicians read about new findings, they would do it in a disorganized and inefficient fashion. So that would result in decisions that did not necessarily reflect objectively the results of the evidence that was available. As a solution, the people who began this movement reorganized concepts that were very well known and suggested a series of steps and tools that are relatively simple that allow to carrying out decision-making process informed by the best possible scientific evidence in an explicit and reproducible way, but without forgetting the particular traits of each decision. And sure, we can say that this method tries to integrate the best information coming from scientific research, the values and preferences of our patients, and the clinical judgment and experience of the physicians, which comes from their interaction between these three, or the interaction of these three components, is what we normally call evidence-based medicine. One of the most important aspects of this new method is that it questioned the expert physician, because now he wasn't the one who would decide what should be done and what not based on their opinion and their experience. It's not that their experience was not valued, on the contrary, but what was demanded is that experience needed to integrate new findings in order to maximize the benefits, minimize risk, and promote efficiency. Let's see the practice of evidence based medicine. The classic steps proposed by this methodology, based on a clinical problem, are to ask a structured question, identify existing evidence in order to respond that, critically analyze the information that's found, and apply it to the complete case, incorporating the patient in the decision. Another way of conceptualizing this method is separating it in two stages. The first is made up by all the necessary steps to synthesize the existing global evidence on a specific query. And the second one is made up by the steps that are required in order to take that information and lead it to a specific decision. Although there's still questioning of this method, in general, people have adopted it as the main form of decision making, both individually and at a population level. In fact, the methodologies coming from other areas have been incorporated and enriched this method instead of following an alternative model. This doesn't mean that the method works perfectly. In fact, in the last few years, many criticism has been raised about things that have to be improved. And there are lots of efforts underway in order to analyze those problems. On the other hand, as this method has been consolidated, we've recognized that evidence-based medicine is perhaps not the best term to describe its use in other areas. There's been discussions about the concept that's evidence-based because it doesn't reflect the spirit of this approximation, where evidence is necessary but not enough to actually make a decision. However, due to the popularity of the term, we've maintained it in an original term in order to avoid confusions. There we go. Perfect. So, the main concepts, or the foundation of this methodology, are pretty simple. Probably most of you know this and it'll make sense. The first point is that there's a hierarchy of evidence. Not all research is equal in terms of the capacity to, to lead us to a hypothetical truth, or the quality of this research in order to provide reliable conclusions. And one of the or one of the study designs or research designs that are most important, most emblematic, is the controlled random trial. They're the randomized controlled trial, and we've also put above this evidence, we've done systematic reviews, meta-analysis as a way, also as a form of evidence, because they play a very important role in decision making. We're going to see that this is the classic approach, but it's not how it's conceptualized today. If you see here in the middle of the pyramid, has the studies, as if you can see. The randomized trials have a series of characteristics We're not going to get into that now, but it makes them ideal in order to provide conclusions when it comes to treatment. They also have the capacity of avoiding errors because we have a control group when we see a natural evolution of a disease, and that could lead us to improper conclusions. It's also capable of creating comparable groups, and we can also add tools such as the use of placebos and other techniques to make sure that the quality of these studies is as high as possible. That's why today plays a fundamental role in this methodology. And on the other hand, the other concept, the second major foundation, is that we can't make decisions only with part of evidence. We need to have all of the evidence regarding an issue or a question or a decision in order to then make the decision correctly. This is what today we call evidence synthesis, with the systematic review. And through explicit and rigorous systematic methodology, we process all the possible scientific studies in order to reach a set of evidences that can then be synthesized with meta-analysis. That's why there's certain confusion between the term systematic review and meta-analysis. They're very interchangeable, but meta-analysis is simple, the mathematical technique to bring together the results of different studies, and systematic review is this process in order to identify all of the evidence and generate an estimate that's objective as possible. Now, the way in which these two concepts come together today, the hierarchy of evidence and systematic review, as shown here, at the bottom we have the different principal study designs, randomized control trials. Then we have cohort studies. But you see, the line that separates them is a curve, because today we're very clear that the different methods, like the Grave method, for example, one of the ones that's most used to synthesize or estimate the certainty of a set of evidence. And these methods allow us that if trials don't have quality enough, or if the studies that don't have certain traits, this can go up and down. The classification isn't static. And systematic review and meta-analysis allows us, kind of like a looking glass, allows us to get closer to this evidence. It allows us to see to get the most out of and benefit from evidence in order to incorporate it in the decision-making process. If we don't use systematic review, what happens is that we fall into cherry picking, right? In English, it's cherry picking, but it's choosing the prettiest cherries from the box. Now, what are cherries in this case? Just certain studies that aren't representative of the whole, and that can respond other elements. For example, our prior beliefs or our prior judgments that we all have. They can also represent conflicts of interest. For example, there could be specific interests that make certain studies be more disseminated or easier to access than others, and there could even be studies that are made public and others that are not, in response to certain interests or other causes. So the way to counter this, to make sure to avoid cherry picking, of only choosing certain studies that aren't representative of the whole, is through the systematic review, or synthesizing evidence. And this becomes very necessary to bring together all of these elements. This is what we classically propose in evidence-based medicine. It's a combination of evidence, context, and values and preferences. This is especially important when the amount of information available in the world grows exponentially. We know that publications are growing 10% per year, and in the last 2 years, with the pandemic, this is accelerated even further. But data is doubled every 2 years. So publications can't even keep up with all the data that's being produced in the world. So there's a huge amount of information. It's an infodemic, if you will, that makes it necessary to use certain approaches in order to not fall into cherry picking or arbitrary selection. At Epistemónicos, as I said at the beginning, it's a project, it's a foundation that created a database for systematic reviews in health. We published our 2020 results, and it summarizes here. We can say that it's very comprehensive. It has it can detect systematic reviews. It can compare other methods. About 97% of the systematic reviews that exist in the world should be included here, and it's more than one could identify with different methods or manual methods. So today there is a place where all these systematic reviews are together, and we can access them. And these systematic reviews, as they've been validated, we've also been producing more. And we believe that there's more than 100 systematic reviews today that are published every day. At least in 2019, we're reaching 150 this year, probably because of the amount of all the research that's taking place because of COVID-19. 10 years ago, this number was 10 or a little bit more than 10. So it shows the explosion of this type of research, proving just how hard it is to make decisions without our methodology, without synthesizing evidence. Now I wanted to show an example of how we approach this problem, or a problem, with this methodology. And in this case, it was in 2016 with a group of researchers and with our foundation, we decided to analyze the effects of cannabis or cannabis derived products as a potential therapeutic tool. Because then it was very controversial all over the world. I would say that the spirit of our research team was to prove up to what point this was true, that cannabis had therapeutic properties. Try to separate in which diseases is it useful and which diseases it's not. Many times we say there's nothing that's useful for everything. So we needed to organize this a little bit to see what are pathologies that are actually good to use cannabis for, and also separate the different components that could be used, be it cannabis or cannabis derived products and different pharmaceutical preparations. So it was a very broad subject. So we thought it was very interesting. From in the foundation, we wanted to put all these methodologies to the test. What we did is start this resource that we had already built of our Epistemónicos database, took all the systematic reviews that had been done on the subject, and start analyzing from that point, from that starting point. And then after that, we also included in the project a new tool, which is the Living Overview of Evidence, or LOVE tool. So this is updated as new information is updated. And this platform is a ranking or classification platform with a mix of artificial intelligence and a network of researchers that helps us process all this information and assign it to the different issues that are tackled by each side. This also allows us to connect it with everything that is needed to synthesize and present this in a useful way. Today we have two versions of this platform. We have standard, so to speak, the one that's available for the public. It's open. It was launched in late 2019. Then the pandemic came around. So for COVID-19, we launched the second generation of the platform, which is much more complete, and it includes not only systematic reviews, but any type of research. And in the case of COVID-19, it's the biggest repository of COVID-19 evidence in the world. Our teams has published, or the fact that it's 100% comprehensive. And this is what we have here internally. It's still not available for other diseases yet, but it's what we've also used to do everything that I'm going to show you now about cannabis. We created a system that allows us to do the entire evidence synthesis process to make it more efficient and also updating it constantly. This is artificial intelligence. If you're interested, this graph shows us that we created very useful artificial intelligence because it could separate different types of articles. But there's other elements that are not artificial intelligence, but instead a network of collaborators who work with our platform. In simple terms, before showing the results, today we have a platform that's available for the public at large. It's iloveevidence.com. You go to therapeutic use of cannabis and cannabinoids, and you can see 476 systematic reviews that we've identified, and each one of them organized by the type of disease, by the subtypes of cannabis and cannabinoids, and it quickly allows you to find the systematic review that responds to whatever questions you may have. There are also many other issues related to demand reduction in drugs and in or different disorders because of substance use, etc. And it's still not public. The second part is still not public, but it also allows us to do all this work very quickly, and it includes more than 1,500 studios or 500 randomized trials that can be very useful to reach conclusions. So basically, what we say is that this would really allow us to avoid cherry picking in an area such as cannabis. So, with a very large group of researchers, actually more than 80, we decided to do this process in all the diseases where cannabis had been proposed as therapeutic. We reached a list of 92 diseases. We compile all the scientific evidence with prior reviews and studies that were not included in those reviews. We generated a summary for each one of these conditions aimed at healthcare professionals, and we did a systematic review of each condition, always oriented towards researchers in order to publish it in international publications. The summary for clinicians were published in a in a journal. It can be in English and Spanish. It's a Chilean publication called MedWave. It's grouped in a special section, and you can access it. So they do basically do a review of all the evidence in 3 or 4 pages. Here, just some quick examples. The first one is that although the summary has 3 or 4 pages, here we can see the summary of the summary, if you will. So for a question, the most typical question that we get when it comes to this product is if they have any role in chronic pain that's not cancer associated. To the right, we see an image that shows all of the evidence that we processed. We have systematic reviews on the rows. I'm sorry, the studies and the columns, we have the systematic reviews. Each little green box is studies included in each review, and this and that allowed us to analyze and reanalyze all of these studies in order to obtain a final synthesis expressed in 3 or 4 pages. It was published in the magazine. So this is the summary of the summary. And what's clear is that cannabinoids, it's not clear whether cannabinoids reduce pain because the certainty of evidence is very low, and there's a high number of adverse effects in patients with pain not associated to cancer. Now, when we balance this, what does this mean? That there's a link to a table, an interactive version. These are tables, the summary of findings table, and together with several organizations, but especially with the European Union, we developed an interactive version, the interactive summary of findings, and the link to this table is also in the summaries. And there, what we can balance the different benefits and risks. In this case, we can see that the main benefit that we could obtain is a reduction of at least 30%, and that happens in 302 of 1,000 people who use cannabinoids, and it goes up to 384. So there's a small rise, and the certainty of this evidence is very low, unfortunately. And on the other hand, we have the adverse effects increase from 619 to 800 something per thousand. So it's a high magnitude, and that's very certain. So this table allows us to see all this information. And if we balance both sides, we see that there's a small increase of the benefit, but a very low certainty, and a much larger increase of adverse effects, and with a high level of certainty. Now, what does this mean? The truth is, although for many people this means that this therapy is suboptimal or improper to actually be used in clinical practice. For others, it could mean something different. Somebody could say, I believe that in certain contexts, it could be worth it to use medication with these traits, and that could depend on other factors. And that's kind of what we wanted to explore. We compared this evidence in the clinical guidelines, and we realized that unfortunately, many of the clinical guidelines that exist on this issue, in this case, we got it from American academia, they were considered a very low percentage of all of the existing evidence. In this case, the red boxes are the studies that were incorporated in order to evaluate a disease in these guidelines. And in our research, what we did was incorporate all of those red boxes and all of the green ones. So the amount of evidence today is such that it's very hard, even for important international organizations, to incorporate all of it in their process. And finally, with all of this information, all of this work, we produced a summary of a summary of the summary. So it's kind of like the summary of the summary of the summary for decision makers. This was specifically for for the Congress here in Chile, the House of Representatives in Chile. They were discussing a law of self growth for therapeutic use. So we provided a summary of all this information in order for them to consider it. And this began a very interesting work that today has this law stopped or stuck. Let's say in 3 years it's frozen in Parliament. And at the beginning, the people thought it was going to be approved very quickly, but this halted that and allowed more time to analyze more in depth this problem. And the summary of the summary of the summary is that based on existing evidence, we conclude that there is no medical condition in which the benefits derived from the use of cannabis or cannabis-derived products are superior to its adverse effects. And the 92 diseases that we analyzed, we could group them in one of three groups. A first in which that there's clear evidence that cannabis or its derivatives are not effective and are associated with adverse effects. A second group in which there could be a slight benefit, but with many adverse effects. Normally, they outweigh the benefits according to constant comparisons. And a third group where it's still unclear whether or not cannabis and its derivatives are effective because it's uncertain evidence. If certainty was very low, those are the cases where it might be worth continuing to do research. Now, in other words, so how much do we know? We know that cannabis is not a therapeutic alternative for the grand majority of conditions, according to the standards that are normally used to actually talk about therapeutic interventions. Now, for some conditions, it might work, but we don't know if the benefits outweigh the risks, and or if they're better than other therapeutic options. That's also very important. And there's a few promising areas in the very early stage of research, but they still haven't been tested. Also, it's important. These are two messages here. Not all cannabis is the same. It's very important that when we evaluate evidence, to put into perspective what we're talking about. The equivalent or the most logical comparison we can do is with morphine, for example. The poppy flower, it leads to the development of medications such as morphine that leads to other opiates that have a clear role, but also have adverse effects in pain management. In the case of cannabis, the plant then leads to more processed products, and that can lead to oils or other artisanal preparations, which also lead to medication. So it's very important to know what we're talking about. And today there's a wide consensus that it's highly improbable for to generate a therapeutic substance for diseases based on cannabis that has variable compositions, and it would be of a lower pharmacological quality. And second, I think this is very important in this area. It's important to compare against alternatives. It's not enough to just say that a medication or a product or an intervention is better than doing nothing, or is better than a placebo, because today there are many alternatives. And if we truly want to have a full outlook in each of the cases, when we think about cannabis as a therapeutic alternative, we need to include it in this equation compared to other possible therapeutic alternatives. And that makes decision even tougher, but it's very important in order to make a well informed decision. Here, I wanted to very briefly show two cases in which this is probably one of the most important variables for decision making. In the case of chronic pain, a systematic review that's of very high quality, very recent, it informed some global clinical guidelines on the use of cannabis derived products for chronic pain, non cancer pain, and associated cancer. And what we see here is that today there's evidence of or a moderate to high certainty that shows that these products have a small benefit or very slight, from small to very small, below what most people define as a clinically relevant benefit, and also have adverse effects. But most of them are temporary, but others can be long term. And this could lead to different recommendations. The recommendation that was done by this group consider that there are countries where the opioid crisis could be an even worse problem, and that could lead that under certain cases, under certain premises, it's better to recommend, for example, a trial with this type of medication. But many recommendations have said that this is not justified, and they've recommended against it. So the evidence can lead to different contexts, and that's also very important to take into account. Another example of epilepsy, one of the types of epilepsy where people have recommended a cannabis-derived product, is a very rare seizure issue. And this analysis not only analyzed cannabinoids, but other anti-seizure medication, and concluded that all the other anti-seizure medication for this syndrome are more effective than cannabinoids, or cannabidiol in this case. So we see that although, at a glance, we could say that cannabidiol could be useful. It's still not proven, but it could be helpful based on some studies. But when we compare it to other anti-seizure medication, it's much less effective. So it's important to take that into account when decision making comes around. A reflection here: we have a moral imperative with patients. We have to offer levels of certainty that are reasonable of what we're doing, and that it will benefit them and not harm them. And at a population level, we have an ethical duty of maximizing benefits, minimizing risk, promoting efficiency, and try to decrease quality gaps. So my main messages or my main takeaways is that today it's impossible to make informed decisions without an evidence-based approach, meaning we have to take into account the hierarchy of evidence and using evidence synthesis. Research evidence is necessary, but it's not enough. And we require major collaborations, what we call the evidence ecosystem, in order to try to translate research into something that can then be used in practice. Today, the volume of information that we have makes it almost impossible for one person acting in isolation, no matter how skilled they are, it's impossible for them to do this process by themselves. We require great collaborations, so that's why we're working with many other groups to try to promote our evidence ecosystem, allowing us to support experts in different areas and decision makers in different places, allowing them to make the best possible decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Dr. Rada. Thank you very much because what's happening is that we need to be scientifically clear on the fact that we need to do things at the same standard that we do things for any other substance or disease. Because here we're talking about the treatment of X disease. How useful is this substance? And probably, Gabriel. Oh, apparently he froze a little bit. Perhaps the first question. Now, you have experience, or maybe two questions. You have experience with other substance that are handled that has such a risk of propaganda versus the real evidence, like cannabinoids and its derivatives. Do you have any experience with other substances like antibiotics or antidepressants or chemotherapy? Do you have any other experience of something similar to this? And what hypothesis do you have on why it happens so much with this substance? Why there's so much manipulation of evidence when it comes to cannabis? It's a very good question, and I'd say it's tough to find an example that's as clear as this one. But obviously, there are certain similarities, and for example, propaganda that exists around this propaganda that's not clearly perceived as propaganda. That makes an interesting difference between this area and the traditional pharmaceutical industry, the medication industry, because people clearly recognize conflicts of interest. Well, when a pharmaceutical company promotes the latest antidepressant, the community reacts with suspicion, with caution. They say, I'm not going to directly listen to what the pharmaceutical company says. Instead, I'm going to read that precaution, and I think it's important to find more objective sources of information. That line is not so clear in the case of cannabis derivatives or in the new field of other drugs with therapeutic ends. We have a series of articles about other psychotropics, including magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, and a series of other things that clearly follow a similar logic. We do see some similarities in terms of this enormous undercover propaganda of massive products like vitamins or other nutritional supplements. There's a propaganda effort that's very strong, and it's a multi-billion-dollar business. It doesn't have the other component of the potential risk that we do see here, but it does share certain traits in terms of your question. And regarding your other question, I would say that it's very interesting what we've learned in this exercise, this academic exercise in the beginning, but now we've scaled it up to try to inform decision making when it comes to therapeutic use of cannabis in real contexts. We not only have to do this once, as academics tend to do, academics, we tend to publish a paper, then we move on to something else, and we kind of forget about it. We never remember it. But here we've realized that we do need to establish collaborations that maintain all of the evidence up to date to adapt to new requirements. If there are real doubts, we want to clarify those doubts and see what science has to say about any doubts that may arise. We cannot leave any room for doubt. And many times, even from an academic point of view, things that might have seemed resolved require a second look. Many times, what happens is that we have thousands of synthesized papers, 80 people working on this for 4 more years, and then somebody pops up. They go to the legislator with one paper or one article that has no hierarchy, and they say, "Ah, but look at this. It says it's very useful." So it's like going back to zero. But we do need to do that exercise. Unfortunately, for us, for academics, we need to have that capability of lobbying, so to speak, for the scientific method, lobbying for the role of scientific evidence in decision making. We oh, thank you very much, Gabriel, and thank you very much to Mariano. The organizers are telling me that we have a little bit less than 10 minutes left to conclude today's session. So we're going to also focus some of the questions that we're receiving from our audience. We received several questions, and one of our attendees, well, you already heard that information of the presentation will be available on the ISSUP website and the recording as well. And Saul Arturo Romero was saying, if Gabriel, if you could once again show the slide where you had the publication platforms, so that people can have them at the ready. And while you show us that, I wanted to ask another question that we get from Carol Lemos about what are the adverse effects that were identified, and how severe are they, according to what she saw in the slide. She's saying that it appears to be a very broad classification and a little bit objective. I think I'm showing the databases. No, I think you stopped sharing your screen. Give me 1 second. There we go. It was there. There we go. So there's the database, epistemoticos.org and iloveevidence.com. Those are the two platforms, and the foundation's website in case you want to know more about us, epistemoticos.cl. And yeah, the information on adverse effects that I presented is very succinct, but we did similar work in terms of synthesizing adverse effects of the different types of cannabinoids. However, most of the relevant information in many of the decision making contexts has to do with the use of cannabis, not pharmacological cannabis, with the use of artisanal preparations, or even consumption of cannabis, just smoking it, the most common form of consumption. The other forms of consumption, or not so much. So that leads to work, even greater work, only evaluating the effect on the diseases themselves, assessing the effect on the population that consumes cannabis, not just for therapeutic ends, but also for recreational reasons. And now we're looking for financing in order to do a similar process to the one that we did with therapeutic cannabis for the effects of using cannabis in its different forms, and not just with therapeutic ends, but also with recreational purposes and different types of pathologies or conditions. Basically, it's a work that we believe could be perhaps 10 times greater than what we've already done in terms of volume. Although we did manage to generate a very broad team for this project, we're still trying to do something similar for the adverse effects, but it's true that to provide a summary of what are the actual adverse effects of consumption of cannabis, be it for therapeutic or recreational purposes, for the different types of products, is quite a task. In general terms, I can see that there's lots of evidence of all of these adverse effects in many types of diseases, but the truth is, what happens is that there's lots of cherry picking. Right now, somebody could pull out a paper that says there's not so much risk or there's not any risk at all. So, and it's important to do this exercise of bringing it all together. So we're lagging on that, but we hope that soon we can to have similar results or information that's processed in the same way for the adverse effects or the risks of using cannabis for not just therapeutic purposes but also recreational purposes. The pandemic delayed those plans a little bit, so we hope that next year or hopefully this year, early next year, we can once again retake that task. Let's, Gabriel, we have to remember that that in 2016 the ONS did uh, a study of the risks of cannabis. So I wanted to ask, how can we promote a substance that clearly causes damage, and we're waiting to see what happens. As you saw that basically it did only damage or very little benefit. So then why do people insist on this? We have to think about the industry, the illegal industry. Why do they insist on this? That's something that I wanted, because we've already described the amount of adverse effect. I think it's fascinating that you can describe the adverse effects in therapy because the recreational effects are well documented. So there's a question that says, what happens with the off-level indication? In psychiatry, we use psychopharmacology. What do you think about that? Yeah, the off-label uses is an issue that's very controversial today. COVID-19 made it even more obvious that we have a problem there. And with COVID-19, at the initial stages, we saw that this off-label effect, this phenomenon, people started using lots of medicines, non-approved emergency use. People thought that everything was interchangeable, and we realized that practically all of those medications were proven as ineffective. And most medication or most therapies that are used to treat COVID-19, unfortunately, many of them are still not available in every country, but there are many forms of treatment that are effective, and they've been created for for the specific disease it was aiming at. So reusing certain medications for other ends, unfortunately, that appears to be a strategy that is very unsuccessful. And that could happen with many other diseases as well. The problem is that we haven't done this exercise of researching this at a larger scale. So I think that the off-label use, emergency use, placebo use will be reanalyzed after the experience that we've gained with COVID-19. But before all that happens, we need to be very careful. We have to do an analysis of the evidence that exists, because in most cases, the risks could outweigh the benefits. And we know also this is a specific area where there's a high chance of third parties or people that have a conflict of interest could apply undue pressure. In the case of medication, that's the area where pharmaceutical companies have done big lobbying, and many international known trials about that have ruled against them. For example, anti-inflammatory or anti-seizure medication used for psychiatric cases have normally been in this off-label world. It's kind of like an open door where there's lots of room for undue pressure, undue lobbying. So professionals, we need to be particularly cautious with those indications. And in this area in particular, I think that without a doubt, it is extremely dangerous because it opens a gateway for undue pressure, undue lobbying, and ignoring scientific method in extremely complex decision making. And with that off-label use that you mentioned, we call it fuera de indicación in Spanish, but it's very important to mention what we have today. Unfortunately, there's lots of effects of medication that supposedly help with COVID, for example, derived from the circumstances that you mentioned. It's the same phenomenon that you're describing. And it really highlights the importance of information. There's a question from Javier Cordova. That's based on multiple evidence studies on cannabis. How does that evidence translated into decision making in the design of public policies for regions and countries that are considering changing their cannabis legislation? Yes, obviously all countries are different, but I'd say for me, there's certain major lessons. One is that therapeutic use of cannabis needs to be very different from a definition of recreational cannabis use. That mix that we've seen in many places is very complex to deal with because there's different criteria, different elements that go behind those decisions. In the case of therapeutic decisions, the elements that we saw in the presentation, there's a balance between risk and benefits, the adverse effects on population, costs, amongst other issues. But for recreational use, there are other elements that come into play. For example, individual freedom, the potential damage to children and teenagers, the impact that it has on crime. So there are many other factors that have to be discussed. So this point would be try to separate both discussions as much as possible. And the second point, which I think is absolutely key, is to do a very categorical distinction between the preparations or medication, pharmaceutical grade medication based on cannabis, and the use of herbal cannabis or artisanal preparations, which have a very low probability of, of providing a therapeutically useful product, and it involves the other risks that we already know. So by separating both elements, the therapeutic and recreational and pharmaceutical from homemade or herbal cannabis, I believe that that's a much more rational conversation and well informed discussion where the true factors, the contextual factors that determine the decision that will be made can be evaluated correctly. Very well. Thank you very much, Gabriel and Jose Luis as well. I think that we've reached our time. We don't want to take, we don't want to abuse our interpreter. So thank you to our interpreter as well for translating into English. We've learned a lot, and I think this really invites us to think about the scientific committee led up by Jeff will continue working on scientific evidence because the international society of professionals needs to be evidence based. We can't play with any other concepts, and which is what you clearly show. It was very fascinating in the British Journal with the eminence based, the providence based. Because if it's not evidence, then what are we doing? And the market as well. We can't forget about that. There are people who have an interest in consumption and they want to sell products no matter what. And and people are not compassionate when it comes to that. It's a tragedy to abuse diseases. I think this propaganda, fake propaganda, or this, and it's especially cruel when it comes to disease. So I think we're done. I think we're doing the closing, Jose Luis. Yes, I also wanted to thank the participation of our friend Gabriel, Dr. Gabriel Rada. Thank you very much for your presentation today. It was very informative. That you shed a lot of light on the subject. Also, thank to Mariano for his initiative, for his participation. Always very interesting. Also, thank our organizers from ISSUP Global and everyone who joined us. And I know that there's lots of open questions still, lots of pending questions, but just as we do with our clinical and academic sessions in our courses from CICAD, where time is never enough either, we'd like to invite you to use the ISSUP forums and look for Dr. Gabriel Rada and his ISSUP profile. And then and many of the networks, we're going to upload the recording to networks and the information that you consider important regarding this today's presentation. And through these same forums, the people who have any pending questions, they could address them to the ISA page. Has great advantages because it's a public forum where all of us are there and we can see all of the information that's shared. So thank you very much to our attendees. And Gabriel, if you have any closing words, and thank you very much on behalf of CICAD. No, just wanted to thank you for the opportunity. I think this is an area that what we're starting here is key. And, and my final takeaway is that we need collaboration. We need to all work together. This isn't a task that anyone can do individually on their own. So I believe it's fantastic what you're doing with this seminary and all the other initiatives. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Bye bye, everyone.